He gave his leftovers to a hungry little girl, but what she said next changed his entire life. Richard Blake sat at the far corner of an elegant restaurant tucked away in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of place where deals were sealed over aged whiskey and business cards passed as currency. The room was filled with the gentle hum of soft jazz and quiet conversations, but Richard heard none of it. His mind was buried deep in a thick stack of papers sprawled across his table, documents entirely in Spanish, legal, technical, dense. A critical acquisition involving one of Spain's fastest-growing logistics firms had reached its final phase, and the paperwork needed urgent review. The problem? His trusted translator had dropped out hours earlier without explanation. No replacement, no warning. Just silence. Richard had always prided himself on control. Control of his time, his company, his image. But tonight, with the clock ticking and his appetite gone, control was slipping. He leaned back in his chair, running a tired hand through his hair. The glass of whiskey next to him remained half full, untouched. His dinner, grilled salmon and asparagus, cooled on the plate. His thoughts spun in circles, trying to recall any Spanish phrases from his college days, any fragment of understanding that could help him salvage this mess. But nothing came. His phone buzzed again. Another message from legal asking for an update. Another reminder that the deal couldn't wait. He was about to respond with a vague excuse when a small voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir, can I eat what you're not finishing?" Richard turned, slightly startled. Standing by his table was a little girl, 6, maybe 7 years old, barefoot, with blonde hair braided into 2 thin plaits. Her red t-shirt was faded, her denim skirt frayed at the hem. Her big blue eyes stared up at him, wide and hungry but steady, without a trace of fear. He blinked, confused for a second. Was she alone? How did she get into a place like this? "You want my leftovers?" he asked, glancing at the half-eaten plate. The girl nodded solemnly. "I'm hungry." He looked around, expecting someone, anyone, to step in. A parent. A waiter. A manager. But no one came. The room carried on as if nothing unusual had happened. "Take it," he said, pushing the plate toward her. "I can't eat. I've got too much going on." She didn't immediately dig in. Instead, her eyes fell on the papers in front of him. "That's Spanish," she said, pointing. "Yeah. And it's a problem," he muttered. She hesitated, then added, "I can read it. If you want." Richard let out a short breath of disbelief. "You can translate legal documents? At your age?" The girl didn't flinch. "My mom was a translator. She taught me. Before she got sick." Something about her voice stopped him from brushing her off. She wasn't lying. Her words were too direct, too certain. Out of nothing but curiosity, or perhaps desperation, he pulled one sheet from the pile and handed it to her. "Go ahead. Let's see what you've got." The girl looked at the paper, her finger moving along the lines. "This part here," she began, "means they're charging an extra fee for international logistics storage. But it's written like it's optional. You can decline it." Richard froze. She was right. He knew enough to understand that. "And this clause," she continued, "says they'll retain partial ownership of your assets in Spain unless you reject this paragraph. You should reject it." Richard leaned forward, stunned. Her pronunciation was flawless. Her comprehension was beyond anything he'd expected. For the first time that evening, he truly looked at her, not as a street child asking for scraps, but as someone who had just handed him the missing piece of a multimillion-dollar puzzle. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lacey," she said. "Where are your parents?" Her expression shifted. "My mom died last year. We used to live in a shelter. Now I don't know." Richard stared at her, unable to respond. The room had grown quiet around them, or maybe his awareness had narrowed to just her small frame, her soft voice, and the impossible story she carried in her eyes. Without thinking, he said the only thing that came to him, "Do you want to come with me? Just for tonight. I'll get you some food. And shoes." She hesitated, then nodded. And with that nod, something shifted inside Richard Blake, a man who had built empires, led corporations, stood on stages, but who, in that moment, realized that the most unexpected meetings could change a life more than any boardroom ever had. As soon as they stepped out of the restaurant, the sharp chill of the evening air wrapped around them. Richard instinctively took off his blazer and placed it gently over Lacey's shoulders. The fabric hung heavily on her small frame, but she hugged it close like it was the warmest thing she'd ever worn. He looked down at her bare feet, now stepping cautiously on the cold pavement, and without saying a word, he led her to his waiting car parked by the valet. The driver opened the door with a confused glance, but Richard's nod silenced any questions. Once inside, the quiet hum of the luxury vehicle filled the silence as Lacey stared at the glowing city lights rushing past her window. She didn't speak, but her expression shifted from cautious to curious as they drove deeper into Manhattan. Richard tapped out a quick text to his assistant, "Call my tailor. I need warm clothes, age 6 or 7, girls. Drop off at my apartment. Also, food." He hesitated and added, "Toys too. Something comforting." Then he put the phone away. He wasn't sure what he was doing. He wasn't the kind of man who brought strangers, especially children, into his private world. His life was sharp-edged, minimal, designed for control and output, not softness. But this girl had cracked something open inside him in the most unexpected way, and for once, he didn't feel like analyzing it. They arrived at his penthouse just past midnight. The elevator opened directly into the marble-floored living room, which was flooded with soft, warm light. Lacey stepped in cautiously, her eyes widening as she took in the massive windows, tall bookshelves, and sleek modern furniture. It was the kind of space designed for prestige, not play. Richard suddenly saw it through her eyes, sterile, cold, and lifeless. "You can sit anywhere you like," he said, unsure of how to speak to her in this context. She wandered slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the glass coffee table before settling onto the sofa, legs tucked under her. Within 30 minutes, the assistant arrived with shopping bags, clothing, and food from one of the best late-night diners in the city. While Lacey devoured a grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup, Richard sat opposite her, pretending to scroll through his emails but mostly just watching her. The way she held the spoon with both hands. The way her eyes lit up when she tasted something warm. There was nothing performative in her gratitude, just silent relief. When she finished, he handed her a new pair of pajamas and pointed toward the guest room down the hall. "It's yours for tonight," he said. "Bathrooms inside. Take your time." She returned 20 minutes later, face freshly washed, her new pajamas slightly oversized but cozy. She was holding a small stuffed bear from the gift bag, gripping it tightly by the arm. Richard stood awkwardly in the hallway, uncertain of how to say goodnight. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I haven't slept in a real bed in a long time." His throat tightened. "You're safe here," he replied. "Get some rest." When he closed the door behind her, he stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at nothing. His apartment, usually so silent and serene, now carried the faint sounds of another heartbeat. He sat in his office, stared at the contract she had helped him read, and realized he owed more than just gratitude. He owed her an answer, to why a child like her was on the street, why no one had come looking, why the system had failed someone so bright and capable. He pulled out his laptop, opened a private database, and began typing her name, Lacey. Age, unknown. Last known location, unknown. He kept typing late into the night, reaching out to contacts, accessing social worker networks, even police reports. There was barely any record of her. It was as if she'd slipped between the cracks of the world. By the time he finally stood up, the sun was beginning to rise. The sky outside had turned a pale violet, and for the first time in years, Richard didn't feel tired after an all-nighter. He walked down the hallway and opened the door just a crack. Lacey was fast asleep, her small form curled beneath the blanket, the stuffed bear tucked against her chest. And in that moment, watching her breathe softly in the quiet, Richard knew something had changed. Not just for her, but for him too. He wasn't just a man trying to close a business deal anymore. He was the beginning of something bigger, something he couldn't yet name, but already felt deep in his bones. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the wide windows of Richard's penthouse, casting long golden lines across the floors. Lacey was still asleep when Richard stepped out of his bedroom, already dressed in a tailored suit, but with none of the urgency that usually pushed him out the door. He moved more slowly now, pausing by the guest room door, listening. When he gently opened it, he saw her curled up just as he had left her the night before, the stuffed bear still in her arms, the soft rise and fall of her breath steady and calm. She looked smaller in sleep, even more fragile somehow, but also peaceful, as if for the first time in a long time, she trusted the world not to fall apart while she rested. He didn't wake her. Instead, he made a quiet call to his assistant and postponed all his meetings until the afternoon. For the first time in over a decade, the world of deals and contracts and shareholder reports could wait. Today, there were more important things to understand. By the time Lacey woke up, breakfast was already set on the kitchen island. Real pancakes, eggs, fruit, and a glass of orange juice. She approached the food hesitantly, like it might vanish if she reached for it too quickly. Richard sat across from her, coffee in hand, watching without pressure. "Eat as much as you want," he said, and she did, slowly at first, then with more confidence. Between bites, she looked around the apartment with curiosity. "Do you live here alone?" she asked. He nodded. "Always have." Her face scrunched a little, as if that answer was hard to understand. "No kids? No wife?" He smiled faintly. "Nope. Just me and work. Until now, I guess." After breakfast, they moved into the living room, where he brought over the documents she had translated. "Can you tell me how you knew all this?" he asked. Lacey looked down at her hands. "My mom was really smart. She used to do translation work from home. Spanish, French, sometimes even Portuguese. She homeschooled me for a while. Said books were safer than most people." Richard could see the truth of that written across her face. "And after she passed?" he asked gently. "Shelters, mostly," she answered. "Some were okay. Some were bad. I ran away from one a few months ago. It didn't feel safe anymore." He leaned back, trying to process the weight of what she had just said so simply. She was 6, maybe 7, and had been through more instability in a year than most adults faced in a lifetime. It didn't make sense. How could someone like her, so smart, so articulate, just disappear into the system? He made more calls that day, not to colleagues or clients, but to child services, hospitals, old shelter records. He wanted to find proof of her story, a file, a birth certificate, something that confirmed she existed. But again and again, he hit walls. In the system, Lacey was barely more than a ghost. Meanwhile, the girl remained calm, almost too calm, like she had already learned not to expect too much from adults. She sat in the office area with a children's book he had ordered that morning, flipping pages slowly, lips moving silently as she read. Every so often she would glance up, as if checking to make sure he was still there, and he always was. Later that afternoon, he took her shopping, not because he liked the idea of showing off, but because she needed things. Shoes, proper clothes, a backpack, warmer pajamas. As they walked through the store, she held his hand without hesitation. When he asked her opinion about a dress or jacket, she answered directly, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with an unimpressed shrug that made him chuckle. They stopped for ice cream afterward, sitting on a bench just outside the park, the city bustling around them. "I don't know why you're helping me," she said between licks of strawberry swirl. "Most people don't even look at me when I talk." Richard didn't answer right away. He looked at her, really looked, and said, "Because you're the first person who's helped me in a long time. And because you shouldn't have to do it alone anymore." That night, after she fell asleep again, he sat in his office in the dark, the soft hum of the city outside the windows. He thought about his life, his perfect schedule, his clean routines, his glass and steel fortress of solitude. None of it felt as solid now as the sound of her footsteps on the marble floor or the image of her tiny hand gripping his without fear. She was still technically a stranger, but something in his chest whispered that wasn't true. Not anymore. He opened his laptop and began researching something new, not business ventures, not legal codes. He typed, "How to become a legal guardian." He didn't know where this road would lead, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't sending her back into the dark. Not when she had already brought this much light into his world. It felt strange, letting go, but also right. When she fell asleep on the couch halfway through, he carried her to the guest room. As he tucked her in, she murmured, barely awake, "Thank you for not making me leave." He brushed a strand of hair from her face and whispered, "You're home now." For the first time in his adult life, Richard Blake didn't feel alone in his own house. He had no idea what the next steps would bring, but he felt something solid beneath him. Not a deal or a strategy, but a purpose. Something real. Something worth holding on to. The week that followed settled into a rhythm that neither Richard nor Lacey had expected. It wasn't perfect, but it was surprisingly natural. Mornings began with shared breakfasts. Richard would usually make something simple like toast and eggs, while Lacey, now eager to help, learned how to squeeze orange juice and even tried her hand at scrambling eggs. She had a habit of humming while she worked in the kitchen, quiet and off-key, but cheerful. Richard, still adjusting to the sounds of life in his home, found himself slowing down in the mornings just to listen. During the day, Richard worked from home more often than not. He had a dedicated office space, and Lacey understood quickly that when he was behind the glass door, it meant quiet time. But still, she would occasionally slip in, barefoot and cautious, carrying one of her books or a curious question about the world. Why do companies need so many meetings? Why is money so important if it doesn't make people happy? He answered the best he could, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with humor, always with honesty. She listened with the attentiveness of someone years older, though she never stopped doodling in the margins of her notebook while he spoke. In the evenings, they explored small parts of the city together. Richard took her to parks, bookstores, even a quiet museum where she stared for 10 straight minutes at a painting of a girl standing in the rain. "She looks like she's waiting for someone who forgot her," Lacey whispered, and it struck him so deeply he couldn't speak for a moment. Sometimes they had dinner out at cozy diners where no one knew who he was. Other times they ordered in and watched movies while sprawled out on the giant living room couch. He never thought he'd know the names of animated characters or care which ones were Lacey's favorites, but now he did. But it wasn't all light. There were nights when Lacey would wake up crying, not with screams or drama, but with soft gasps that she tried to hide. Richard heard her once, sitting on the floor of the guest bathroom with the light off. When he found her, she tried to smile through tears, saying she just had a sad dream. He sat beside her on the cold tile and said nothing at first, just stayed until her shoulders stopped shaking. Then he asked if she wanted to talk. Slowly, she told him about the last shelter she had lived in, the cramped beds, the yelling at night, the fear of being moved again and again. She told him about her mother, how she used to sing in Spanish and tell stories from old books they read together. She said words were stronger than walls, Lacey said. But words didn't keep her alive. Richard didn't have the right words to answer that. He simply said, "I'm not going anywhere. Not tomorrow. Not next week. I promise you that." She didn't respond, but she leaned against him, and that was enough. Later that week, Richard took another step. He brought Lacey to meet one of his lawyers, a kind woman named Clara who specialized in family law. Clara had experience with guardianship cases and was known for taking on complex personal matters. They sat in a quiet room with warm lighting and soft chairs, and Clara spoke to Lacey gently, not like a client or a case, but like someone who mattered. Lacey answered questions carefully but openly, describing what she remembered about her mother, the time on the street, how long she'd been on her own. Clara took notes but never rushed. Richard watched the entire exchange with quiet tension, wanting to intervene, to protect her from any discomfort, but knowing he needed to let her speak. When the meeting ended, Clara told Richard privately that it wouldn't be simple. Without clear documentation or family records, guardianship would take time and effort. But she also said, "You're the first adult to care this deeply about her, and that counts for more than you realize." Back at the penthouse, Lacey asked, "Will I have to go to court?" Richard explained the basics, how some people might want to ask questions to make sure she was safe and cared for. She nodded, thoughtful, and asked, "Will you be there?" He looked her in the eye and answered without hesitation. "Every single step." That night, as he turned out the lights and checked in on her one last time before going to bed, he realized something strange had happened. He wasn't just looking after a child anymore. He was fighting for her, building a future that neither of them had planned but both clearly needed. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly why he was waking up every morning. It wasn't for quarterly reports or expansion deals. It was for a small girl with eyes full of stories and a laugh that echoed in his once silent home. By the end of the second week, the walls of Richard's penthouse no longer echoed with sterile silence. There were books on the coffee table that didn't belong to him, small socks tucked into corners, colored pencils left behind on the kitchen island, and a faint trace of lavender shampoo in the guest bathroom. Lacey had changed the atmosphere of the apartment not by design but simply by existing in it, and Richard realized he didn't miss the way things had been before. Not the quiet, not the spotless perfection, not even the freedom that once felt so important. What he had now was better, fuller, even if it was still unfamiliar. One morning, after breakfast, Richard received a call from Clara, the family lawyer. Her tone was careful, but hopeful. She had managed to locate the last known record of Lacey's mother, a case file from a city hospital that matched the timeline and personal details Lacey had provided. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give the case legitimacy. There was, however, still no trace of a birth certificate or legal documentation tying Lacey to any living relatives. This meant that until further notice, she was technically a ward of the state. Richard didn't like that. Not because of the label, but because it made her sound like a case number instead of a child. He hung up and spent the next hour pacing his office. He hated feeling helpless, but this wasn't something he could solve with a check or a phone call to the boardroom. It required time, legal work, and, most of all, patience. That last part wasn't his strength. Still, he reminded himself, this was about Lacey, not him. She deserved someone who would fight for her with more than just money. That afternoon, he took her to a private tutoring center. He didn't want to send her to a public school yet, not until her paperwork was sorted, but he knew she needed structured learning, challenge, and connection with other kids. The director of the center, a woman named Marianne, administered a few placement assessments. Lacey aced most of them. Her reading level was years ahead of her age. Her comprehension skills stunned even the director. But there were gaps too, math concepts she hadn't learned, areas of science she'd never been exposed to. Marianne looked at Richard with quiet astonishment. "This child is extraordinary. And from what I can see, she's been doing it all on her own." When they returned home, Lacey was quiet. Richard asked if something was wrong, and she simply said, "I don't want to be too smart." He frowned. "Why?" She shrugged, eyes cast down. "Because it makes adults leave. They think I don't need help." Richard leaned down until he was eye level with her. You can be as smart as you want, Lacey. That doesn't change the fact that I want to be here. Her eyes filled for a moment, and then she nodded, almost imperceptibly. That night, she asked to help him with work. He smiled at the request but handed her one of the translated Spanish contracts from earlier. To his surprise, she sat with it for an hour, making small notes in the margins. When she handed it back, she'd circled 2 phrases with simple comments: "This part is vague. They might use it against you." And, "This word changes the meaning. Check with legal." He stared at the paper for a long time after she went to bed, marveling at her insight. She was a child, yes, but she was also something rare, and she was growing in front of his eyes faster than he could keep up. That week, he also started therapy, not just for himself, but for both of them. He found a therapist who specialized in trauma and childhood development. The first few sessions were slow, careful. Lacey didn't say much at first, but she sat close to Richard, and her body language showed she trusted him. The therapist encouraged them to build small rituals, things that could help her feel safe. So Richard started something new. Every night before bed, they read a story together. It was simple, almost too simple for a man like him used to strategy and planning, but the way Lacey leaned into his shoulder as he turned pages made him feel like he was doing something right. One evening, as they closed the book, Lacey looked up and asked, "Do you think my mom would be proud of me?" The question stopped him cold. He didn't rush his answer. Instead, he put the book down and looked her in the eyes. "I think she'd be amazed by you. I think she'd want you to keep learning, keep growing, and keep trusting people who love you. Like I do." She nodded again, her lip trembling just slightly, and then she whispered, "Okay." Later, after she fell asleep, Richard walked to the window and stared at the city lights. The world outside was loud, chaotic, relentless, but in here, something was being built. Slowly, day by day, a life was forming between 2 people who had once been strangers. He didn't know exactly what the future looked like, but he knew this: whatever came next, he wasn't letting go. Not now. Not ever. On a rainy Thursday morning, something unexpected arrived at Richard's office in a plain white envelope, an official letter from family court. The preliminary hearing for temporary guardianship had been scheduled for the following week. His hands trembled slightly as he held the envelope. He had faced investors, board members, hostile takeovers, and billion-dollar mergers with a calm and calculated confidence, but this piece of paper concerning a child he hadn't even known a few weeks ago, left his heart racing in a way nothing else had. It was no longer just about providing shelter or giving kindness in a moment of need. This was about becoming something permanent. A father, in some form. And that reality was both thrilling and terrifying. He spent the rest of the day gathering every document Clara had requested: his financial statements, background checks, character references from longtime employees, and a heartfelt personal letter explaining why he wanted custody of Lacey. That part, the letter, was the hardest. He rewrote it 4 times. Each version started too formally, too detached, until he finally let himself speak honestly, writing not like a CEO, but like a man who had found something, someone, that mattered more than any success he had ever chased. He wrote about her mind, her resilience, her compassion. He wrote about the night she first translated the contract and changed everything. He admitted, without shame, that he needed her just as much as she might need him. At home, he debated how to tell Lacey. She was sitting on the floor in her pajamas, coloring with her new markers, surrounded by pillows and a half-eaten bowl of popcorn. Her presence had brought life into every corner of the penthouse. He sat beside her, picking up one of the markers without asking. "Lacey," he began, "we have something important coming up next week. A meeting, with a judge. She'll ask us some questions about how we've been doing. About whether we want to stay together." She paused, marker frozen above the page, then turned her head slowly toward him. "Is it court?" He nodded. But it's not like a scary courtroom. More like an office. You'll be with me the whole time. She looked down again, drawing a thick blue line across the bottom of the page. Will she make me leave? The words were quiet but heavy, like they'd been waiting in her for days. He set the marker aside and reached for her hand. Not if I have anything to say about it. I want you to stay. I'm doing everything I can to make sure that happens. And I'll never let anyone take you somewhere unsafe again. She blinked fast, clearly holding something back. I used to pretend court was a game when I had to go with my mom. But it was never fun. Richard didn't try to fix that memory. He just nodded and held her hand tighter. In the days leading up to the hearing, they prepared in small ways. Clara came over twice to help explain what the process might be like. She spoke gently, always letting Lacey lead with questions. Lacey asked if the judge would be mean. Clara smiled and said, "She's not mean. She just has to make sure everyone's safe and cared for." That seemed to comfort her, if only a little. On the night before the hearing, Lacey stood in front of her closet, picking out her clothes like it was a school recital. "Do I have to look fancy?" she asked. "You should look like yourself," Richard said. "That's who the judge needs to see." The morning of the hearing, Richard felt a kind of nervousness he couldn't explain, not the professional anticipation he was used to, but something more fragile, more vulnerable. Lacey wore a soft yellow dress with a denim jacket and her favorite sneakers. She clutched her stuffed bear, Oliver, in one hand and held Richard's hand with the other. In the back seat of the car, she was quiet, staring out the window. When they arrived, Clara was already waiting in the courthouse lobby. She gave Lacey a warm smile and knelt down to fix a loose button on her jacket. "You ready?" she asked. Lacey nodded, not quite bravely, but not fearfully either. Inside the judge's office, things were quieter and less intimidating than Lacey had imagined. There were soft chairs and a window that let in natural light. The judge was an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled into a neat bun. She introduced herself simply as Judge Maynard and made no mention of laws or proceedings at first. Instead, she asked Lacey what she liked to read, what her favorite food was, whether Richard let her eat dessert before dinner, to which Lacey replied with a small smirk, "Only once, but it was a really bad day." Then the questions got harder. "Do you feel safe here?" "Yes." "Do you want to stay with Mr. Blake?" "I do." When asked why, Lacey paused, looked at Richard, then said, "Because he listens. Because he makes pancakes, even when he burns them. Because he tells the truth. And because he doesn't treat me like I'm a problem to fix." Richard felt the sting of tears but didn't let them fall. Judge Maynard turned to Richard next. Her questions were sharper. "Do you understand the full responsibility you're asking for?" "Yes." "Are you prepared for this to be permanent?" "Absolutely." "Why this child?" Richard's voice didn't waver. "Because she found me when I didn't know I needed to be found. Because I see the world differently now. Because I can't imagine waking up without hearing her footsteps in my home." The judge sat back in her chair, nodded slowly, and said they would be notified soon of the next steps. It wasn't a final decision, but it was a step forward. As they left the courthouse, Lacey squeezed Richard's hand hard and whispered, "Thank you for saying those things." He looked down at her and said, "They weren't things, Lacey. They were the truth." The rain had stopped by the time they reached the car, and for the first time that day, Lacey grinned, wide and bright, like the sun had been waiting for them to walk back outside. 2 weeks after the court hearing, Richard received a call from Clara that would forever mark the moment everything changed. He had been sitting at his kitchen table, sipping black coffee and watching Lacey as she meticulously glued colorful cutouts into her handmade scrapbook. When the phone rang and he saw Clara's name, his stomach tightened. He walked out onto the balcony before answering, both to avoid worrying Lacey and to brace himself for anything. Clara's voice, calm but warm, broke through the line. "It's official, Richard. The court approved temporary guardianship, with a pathway toward full adoption if that's your choice. Congratulations. She's officially in your care. For a few seconds, Richard couldn't speak. The city below moved as it always had, but everything in his life felt still, like a single frame frozen in time. The weight of uncertainty, the cautious hope he had been carrying for weeks, finally broke and released something he hadn't known he was holding: relief, gratitude, purpose. When he went back inside, Lacey looked up immediately, sensing something had shifted. He knelt beside her, held her hand gently, and said, "You're staying. For good, if you want to." She blinked at him, her expression unreadable at first. Then slowly, she nodded, and without a word, wrapped her arms tightly around his neck. They stayed that way for a long time, her small arms clutching him like an anchor, like she had finally allowed herself to believe it was real. In the days that followed, their life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it did become steady. Richard enrolled Lacey in a private school that catered to children with unique backgrounds and learning paces. On her first day, she clutched his hand nervously as they walked through the wide glass doors, her backpack slightly too big for her frame. He knelt down and told her, "You belong here just as much as anyone. And I'll be here when the day ends." When he picked her up later, she was holding a new book and chatting with another girl her age. The sight filled him with a quiet pride he hadn't known he could feel. They began forming rituals together. Sunday afternoons were for the bookstore and ice cream. Friday nights were for movies and takeout. Every morning, she left him a drawing or a note on the kitchen counter, sometimes just a silly face, other times a sentence like, "You're the best pancake burner ever," or, "Thanks for not giving up on me." He kept them all in a drawer in his office, each one a reminder of how far they had both come. One weekend, they visited the cemetery where Lacey's mother had been buried, a modest stone in the corner of a quiet green hill. Lacey had asked to go. She brought a letter she had written and read it aloud softly while Richard stood beside her. She spoke about her new home, about the bear she still slept with, about the man who made her feel like she mattered. "I miss you, but I'm okay now," she finished. Richard didn't say anything afterward. He didn't need to. That evening, they sat on the balcony together watching the sky turn orange and pink over the city. Lacey leaned her head on his shoulder and said, "I think my mom would like you." He swallowed hard and nodded. "I hope so." She added, "You don't have to be perfect. You're just, you. And that's good." He smiled. For once, he didn't feel the urge to fix or plan or perfect. He just sat there with her, with the city stretching out before them and a life full of unknowns waiting beyond the horizon. Richard Blake had once believed that success came from control, from strategy, from never letting anything or anyone too close. But now, he knew better. His greatest achievement wasn't the skyscrapers bearing his name or the empires he had built. It was sitting beside him, small and fierce and brave, looking at the world with wide, curious eyes. She had walked into his life asking for leftovers. Now, she had all of him. And in return, she had given him something he'd never had before: family. This story's ending delivers something truly rare, a quiet, earned sense of hope that feels both deeply emotional and completely believable. What begins with a chance encounter, an exhausted millionaire and a hungry, brilliant little girl, evolves into a story not about wealth or rescue, but about healing, connection, and the power of choosing each other. I think the beauty of this ending lies in its simplicity. Nothing is flashy, no miracles happen overnight, and yet the transformation feels monumental. Lacey doesn't just gain stability, she regains trust, voice, and identity. Richard doesn't just become her guardian, he becomes human in the truest sense, discovering joy in vulnerability and strength in love. The moment he realizes that success isn't about power, but about people, is where the story finds its deepest meaning. To me, the final image, two souls, once broken in different ways, now sitting quietly on a balcony with the world stretching out before them, is the perfect way to close their journey. It's not a dramatic twist. It's not a perfect fairy tale. It's something better, a real, earned, and life-affirming reminder that sometimes the family we never expected becomes the one that saves us.